Okay, crash course in Russia. I know bugger all about Russia, but I've just been on a jog. I've done a 20-minute crash course listening to an audiobook. Okay, this is how it looks to me so far. Match this up against someone who's been studying it for years. The wind. Okay, as far as I can tell, that area were, well, let's call them Eastern Slavs, is what they were at the start. We don't know who was there. Okay, Eastern Slavs sounds good enough. All right, and at some point, Viking Rus, sort of from the Scandinavian lands, came over there and became their rulers. So a little bit like a Norman conquest of sorts. Now, context: if you're a Russian or a Rus, or a Mongolian or any of the peoples in the Eurasian steppes, that whole area that Russia occupies today, you are in a constant state of, a permanent state of insecurity. You're freaking out all the time because you're exposed. It's all very well, I think, if you're an Englishman and you've got a nice channel between you and Europe, or if you're an Italian and you've got those beautiful Alps, or if you're an Australian and you've got AUKUS and ocean all around. It's all very well if you're one of us guys saying, why are you freaking out so much, Vladimir Putin? Adhere to the world rules-based order. But all through the centuries, apparently, all through the millennia, people on the steppes, STEPPES, have their whole character is dictated by the fact that they live out in the open. They're exposed, all right. So that that kind of tells you why the Mongols were like the Mongols a little bit. Genghis Khan had to take the whole thing. It's the only way he could feel secure. He had to take everything from Korea all the way through to Hungary. The entire grasslands right across there. Genghis Khan had to take all that. It's the only way he could bring law and order into place. Russia has kind of done that in reverse. It's pretty big, It's pretty big. It's not as big as the Mongol Empire was, because the Mongolian Empire went further than that. They went all the way down to India, and they took China, and they started China, really, the Mongol Empire, and they went down into Southeast Asia and created Thailand and Vietnam and Laos and all that sort of stuff, and they all went all the way into the Middle East and took Uzbekistan and Afghanistan and all those hard to take places. They took them, and they took Russia, and they took everything, and they took Poland, and they took a lot. They took Iraq, and they took Iran. That was the Mongols. They went a bit further than the Russians. All right, they took Georgia. I'm not sure if Georgia even existed back then, doesn't matter. All right, so what's going on now? Okay, so at some point in time, the Mongols came, as I've just mentioned, and swept across the plains and proved that the area that we now call, Moscow, Kiev, and all that sort of stuff, was vulnerable. They had a right to be in a constant state of vulnerability, insecurity, and all that sort of stuff. The Rus, who had as their centre, what you might call capital, Kiev, which is in the Ukraine now, but they're just Rus at this point, the Kievan Rus. And there wasn't really such a thing as Moscow, there wasn't really such a thing as a unified China. Before the Mongolians came. The Mongolians came, Kublai Khan by then, and created a unified China, and that's what we're dealing with right now, that unified China, that includes, getting blown away here, includes the Uyghurs and Tibet and all that sort of stuff. Blame Kublai Khan for that, as far as I can tell. All right, but back over to Russia, because the Mongolians had Russia and China and all those other joints. All right, so what's going on there? Okay, well, the Mongols had this system: show loyalty to us and we'll look after you. Don't, and we'll slaughter you. And in that way they brought peace. It's not a bad system if you live on the steppes, it's all very well, being English and having a nice little channel, or Australian, and so on, like I said before. All right, it's all right for us to judge. We live in secure-ish lands, But imagine just living out in the open all the time. The Mongolians did. Out completely in the open. Rival tribes used to camp near each other. They didn't try and hide because there's nowhere to hide. They used to camp near each other so they could keep an eye on each other at night. That's bizarre, they didn't kind of hide from each other. There was nowhere to go. It's a whole different sort of way of thinking. And that east versus west thinking is something we can't get our heads around very easily, and probably underlies some of the disconnection, or as they say these days, disconnect, between the Western mindset and the Eastern mindset to this day. All right, so at some point in time, yes, the Mongols decided to start Moscow. Not really, but they made, there were some minor princes in the area that is now Moscow. Moscow, who pledged great loyalty to the Mongols. Very clever move. They were showered with royalty, and the center of gravity of the Rus people shifted from Kiev across to Moscow, and Moscow became a city, really. In that way, the Mongols kind of started Moscow, in the same way that they started Chinese nationalism. All right, blame those bastards. Now, what next? As far as I heard in my little 20-minute crash course. Okay, so the center of, Moscow, so the center of, there's no real Ukraine and Russia back now at this point. But I think right there, you start to see it. Just like you start to see the beginnings of the Uyghur versus China problem and the Tibet versus China problem back with the Mongols, you start to see two little groups there. Because the center of gravity of the Rus people has shifted from Kiev, which, we now sort of might start to say is kind of the Ukrainians. You've got a Romsey-Lansfield situation here, and Moscow starts to grow. Now, at some point, and now the Mongols start to decline at this point too. It's a long story, I won't get into that one. It's got something to do with Black Death, but also infighting. Before the Black Death, there was infighting between the Khans of the Mongol Empire, and obviously that's never a good thing. Okay, so what happens is the Mongols start infighting, and the kind of grand king of Moscow, but a vassal king, like what's his name? Pontius Pilate. No, who was his boss? King Herod was a vassal king of the Romans. This Muscovite, Dmitri, is his name, a Greek name. He notices the Mongols are starting to not be so powerful at the moment. So he doesn't send his tribute, as it's called. When you're a vassal state, you have to send tribute, taxes, across the Mongols notice this and send an army out. And for the first time ever, really, the Mongols are defeated. Dmitri beats them. It was unbelievable. Shocked the world, a little bit like, the fall of Western Rome. The Mongols have been defeated in battle. And they were slaughtered too. And, you start to see Russian identity growing here. Now, the Kievians are over there too. I don't know, that's Romsey. We're talking Lansfield now. Now, you do start to see a difference. There is a bit of a difference, So Putin likes to say, we in Ukraine are all one mob, choose your truth. Now, so what happens next? Well, the Mongols, even though they're on the wane, after they get defeated, they send another mob and absolutely slaughter and trash Moscow. A little bit like Napoleon would one day occupy Moscow, and Moscow would be razed to the ground, but that's another story. With Napoleon sitting in the Kremlin, all right. The Mongols come and teach them a lesson. That was not pretty. It just shows how vulnerable it is. You are being in these lands. All right. Now what happens? Okay, so then you've got a Russian identity, and then now it's a kind of eastern land at this point in time, doing business with Mongols and things like that. It's the east, it's not the west. And it takes on It interviews all the religions at the time. I learnt all this stuff in 20 minutes, believe it or not, and I'm up to 10 minutes here, so I'm going to try and halve it plus a bit. You could have listened to the podcast that I just listened to, but I'm more interesting. Now, okay, so they interview, look, the guy at the top at that point in time, can't remember his name because it doesn't matter, interviewed all the major religions to decide which, because he was trying to unify the Rus, around Moscow. And he interviewed Islam, deal breaker, can't drink. 100%, that was the reason they didn't take that thing on. Okay, didn't like the Jews, and didn't like the Western Christians. Liked the Greek Christians, which was Rome. Rome at that point in time, the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine Empire, based in Constantinople. All right. Now the Western Roman Empire had fallen, but the Eastern Roman Empire hadn't. So they said, we're going to take on this Greek stuff, this Roman stuff, this Byzantine stuff. It's all the same thing. Okay, and that's why there's a big link between the Greek Orthodox Church to this day and the Rome and the bloody Russian Orthodox Church. All right. What happened next? I was only on there for 20 minutes. I'm up to 11 now. I'm going to take longer than that girl I was listening to. All right. What happened then? So they took on the religion. Oh, they took on Eastern. I did say the Mongols came back and sacked the joint. Yes. I can't remember what happened next. Okay, 1139. But you start to see this Russian identity arising, and I think Vladimir Putin is reaching back to that. There was a time it was a kind of eastern land by then. Yes, it was still east. Peter the Great, heard of him? There's a piece of music about him with animals. Peter the Great decided to turn Russia west-looking instead of east-looking. That was a big turning point. Because Russia isn't Western and it isn't Eastern. It's just exposed between the both. And it's always nervous. That's why it probably doesn't like NATO coming up to its doorstep. It doesn't like that any more than it liked the Mongolians coming up a long time before, because you need a buffer zone that's about 2,000 miles wide if you're a Russian, and I don't think Westerners understand that. They need a big buffer. They need all of that. Ukraine and all that sort of stuff. They need all those places. They actually probably need Poland and all that sort of stuff. They need the whole USSR really, just to stay safe. I think that's a big point, Oh, Putin is a really bad guy. Well, he is, but you have to be, But Genghis Khan was a really bad guy too, but don't judge him. Genghis Khan totally slaughtered whole cities. Don't judge him. Well, don't. It's a very confusing thing for an Australian, all of this. All right. This is where I get a bit sketchy. What happened then? I was going good, and then I think I was going for my PB at that point in time, so I started to not listen so much. Peter the Great turned Russia to the west. At that point in time, Russia is it's between two worlds, east and west, and really Russian identity starts to build from there. Now, the Kievians, those Rus over there, they're a bit closer to the west, so they've got a sort of slightly more Western-looking outlook. I wouldn't say the Russians have got a strongly Eastern outlook since Peter the Great, but they're not Western either. You know what they are? They're Russian. And I think their thinking is, and I think Putin is totally switched into all of this. This kind of explains the birth of the USSR, I think. Or one of the reasons the USSR might have come about. You need something this big, this thing that Russia's got. If you haven't got something that big, you'll be squeezed pretty soon because you're exposed. If Russia lets NATO come right up to its doorstep into Ukraine, that's a little bit like letting the Mongols right up to the doors of the gates of Moscow at the other end. It's not smart. I understand it. I understand it. That's where Putin is now. Why is Putin just that little bit expansive at the moment? Well, it's his only protection, I'd guess. And he's a bloodthirsty bastard.